They were supposed to be the kings of the jungle, not prisoners of a forgotten war. Yet there they were, trapped behind rusting cages, their once proud roars reduced to weak, broken cries. It wasn't hunger that killed them fastest. It was the sheer betrayal of the world that had once adored them. When word first leaked that lions were starving to death in a crumbling zoo right inside a brutal war zone, no one wanted to believe it. After all, who had time for animals when human lives were being lost by the thousands? The news came out almost by accident. A young journalist, embedded with aid workers, wandered into the abandoned zoo while chasing a different story. What he found made him drop his camera and run for help. Dozens of lions, their rib cages sticking out like barbed wire, their manes matted with dust and dried blood, barely alive. They didn't even have the energy to lift their heads when they saw him. Some were already dead, collapsed against the bars like discarded rags. Others lay breathing so shallowly it was hard to tell they were alive at all. The images he captured that day were too horrifying to ignore. Within hours of posting them online, the pictures went viral. The world, already exhausted from endless reports of bombings and massacres, suddenly woke up for a different reason. These were lions, symbols of strength, courage, pride, and they were dying in the dirt, forgotten like trash. And somehow that cut through the noise in a way no human tragedy had. Outrage exploded. Celebrities started tweeting. Activists demanded action. For the first time in months, humanitarian planes rerouted, not for soldiers, not for weapons, but for lions. Donations flooded in from countries that hadn't agreed on anything in decades. People who couldn't agree on politics, religion, or borders suddenly united under one desperate cry: save the lions. But the zoo was trapped in a no-man's land, surrounded by shifting battle lines. Getting in, and worse, getting out, was a suicide mission. Several animal rescue groups refused, calling it impossible. A few said they would try, but quietly backed out once they realized how dangerous it really was. It was then that a ragtag group of volunteers stepped up. They weren't soldiers. They weren't zookeepers. Some were former animal rights activists. Some were just adrenaline junkies looking for a cause. A couple of them had been smuggling people across borders before they even learned how to drive. Together, they formed what the media later called the Mad Rescue. The plan was reckless. It involved sneaking across multiple war zones, bribing guards, dodging landmines, and somehow convincing a dozen half-dead lions to trust them. Nobody expected them to make it back alive. Honestly, nobody expected them to even make it in. And yet, against all odds, against every piece of logic and reason, the first rescue truck roared to life one grim morning and barreled straight toward the nightmare. The first time the rescue team saw the zoo, it didn't even look like a place where life could still exist. The fences were bent and twisted, some blown open by shell fire. There were scorch marks everywhere. The cages were more like open graves. As the truck rumbled to a halt outside the entrance, no one spoke. They just stared, their stomachs sinking. It was worse than the pictures had shown, much worse. They moved fast. Every second they stayed there was a second closer to getting shot at, or worse. The team split up, moving toward the enclosures with bags of sedatives, ropes, stretchers, anything they could carry. The lions didn't react much when they approached. They were too weak, too far gone. Some could barely open their eyes. Others didn't move at all, and it was hard to tell if they were breathing. One of the rescuers, a woman named Dana, found a lioness curled in a corner. She had been a queen once. You could still see the power in the line of her jaw, the grace in her battered body. Dana knelt down slowly, whispering soft words even though she knew the lioness couldn't understand. She didn't need to. It wasn't about language. It was about letting the lioness know that for once, a human wasn't there to hurt her. As the team worked, gunfire cracked somewhere in the distance, close enough to make the truck driver panic and start the engine. They had maybe an hour, tops, before the area became too dangerous to stay. Dana and the others hurried, darting from cage to cage, assessing which lions were strong enough to move and which ones weren't. Not everyone could be saved. It broke them. Every single person there wanted to take them all, but they didn't have the trucks, the sedatives, or even enough safe space to transport so many dying animals. Hard choices had to be made, fast and cold. Lions that were too far gone had to be left behind. Dana stood over one old male, his breath rattling in his chest like a broken machine, and cried silently before she turned away. In total, they managed to sedate and load up 9 lions onto makeshift stretchers. It was clumsy and chaotic, lifting half-ton predators with little more than blankets and desperate hands. But somehow, they got it done. The lions were tied down gently but firmly inside the truck, their heads covered to keep them calm. A single bump too hard, a single roar too loud, and the entire mission could still fall apart. Just as they slammed the doors shut, a radio crackled with a warning. Enemy patrols were moving in. They had minutes, maybe less. Tires screamed against the broken pavement as the truck lunged forward, weaving and jerking like a drunk man trying to outrun death. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. Every single person on that truck knew. If they didn't make it across the border before nightfall, the lions weren't the only ones who would die. The drive out of the war zone was pure madness. Roads were bombed out. Checkpoints popped up without warning, and armed men prowled the ruins like ghosts. Every time the truck slowed down, the lions shifted and groaned in the back, barely conscious but still dangerous enough to tear someone apart if they panicked. The rescuers kept glancing at each other, their hands trembling on rifles and makeshift maps, silently praying that the truck wouldn't break down or get stopped. At one checkpoint, a group of soldiers flagged them down, guns raised. The driver's heart almost stopped. They weren't supposed to be here. These men weren't part of the plan. One wrong move and this whole thing would end with blood soaking into the dirt. The driver forced a smile, holding up fake papers and mumbling about aid supplies. The soldiers didn't buy it for a second. One of them yanked open the back of the truck and froze. His gun lowered an inch when he saw what was inside. Lions. Real lions. Even in a place where death was normal, nobody expected to find half a zoo being smuggled out in broad daylight. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The soldier turned back to his men, barking rapid orders. The rescuers braced for a firefight, but instead the soldiers just let them go, waved them through like ghosts passing into the next world. Nobody understood why. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was shock. Maybe even hardened killers still had a soft spot for something innocent. Nobody asked questions, they just drove. The border was still hours away, and the truck was running dangerously low on fuel. Worse, some of the lions were starting to wake up. One massive male thudded against the side of the truck with a low, confused growl. If they came to while trapped, if they panicked, the rescuers wouldn't stand a chance inside that small space. Donna crawled into the back, whispering soft, desperate words, trying to calm them down. She stroked the manes, rubbed ears, anything to keep them from rising into full panic. It shouldn't have worked. But somehow, against all odds, it did. Maybe the lions understood they were being saved. Maybe they were just too exhausted to fight anymore. As the sun began to set, the truck hit the last stretch of road toward the border. A broken sign dangled above them, riddled with bullet holes. Beyond it lay a narrow crossing manned by a different group of soldiers, ones who had been paid off days earlier to turn a blind eye. They were almost there. The rescuers could practically taste freedom. Adrenaline rushed through their veins so hard it made their hands shake. After everything, the gunfire, the hunger, the broken bodies, They were so close. So damn close. But nothing in a war zone is ever that simple. Just a mile from safety, they spotted another group blocking the road. A militia unit, armed to the teeth, and not part of any deal. And this time, there would be no mercy. The truck screeched to a halt, tires kicking up clouds of dust. The militiamen ahead raised their weapons, shouting commands in a language none of the rescuers fully understood. It didn't matter. Guns all spoke the same language. Dana's heart thudded so loud she thought it might burst out of her chest. They had no backup, no real weapons, and no way to outrun them with half-dead lions in the back. One of the rescuers, a wiry man named Malik, jumped down from the truck with his hands raised. He wasn't armed, wasn't threatening, just a man who looked tired and beaten down by life. Maybe it was the smartest move he could make. He walked slowly toward the men, talking fast, mixing a little Arabic, a little English, desperate to explain that they were just aid workers. The militia leader wasn't buying it. He barked something harsh, waving his rifle toward the truck. A few of his men advanced, their eyes cold, curious. Dana bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. If they opened the truck and saw the lions, if they thought they could sell them or use them for some twisted kind of entertainment, they'd never be allowed to leave. And then, the strangest thing happened. One of the lions inside let out a low, rumbling roar. It wasn't strong. It wasn't the full, majestic sound a healthy lion should make. But it was enough. The militiamen froze, their faces twisting into fear. Even broken, even dying, the lions still held an ancient power that no amount of guns could erase. One of the younger soldiers muttered something and took a step back. Another made a hurried sign against evil. Superstition was thick in these parts. To them, lions weren't just animals. They were omens, spirits. To interfere with them was to curse yourself forever. The leader hesitated, glaring at the truck like he could burn it down with his eyes alone. But even he wasn't willing to take that risk. With a snarl of frustration, he waved his men aside, spitting into the dirt as he did. The truck lurched forward again, moving slow at first, then faster, faster, as the rescuers whooped and hollered inside, unable to believe their luck. Malik collapsed back into the front seat, laughing with a kind of wild relief that sounded halfway to crying. Minutes later, they crossed the border. No bullets, no explosions, no betrayal. They were safe. For the first time in months, maybe years, something good had actually happened inside a war zone. It felt almost unreal, but it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The lions still needed emergency care. They were still fighting for every breath. The team knew they couldn't relax. Freedom was just the first step. Now came the real battle, bringing these broken kings and queens back to life. And in the coming days, the world would see just how deep the scars of survival really ran. Crossing the border felt like winning a war. But what greeted them next was a brutal reality check. The rescue camp was nothing more than a few battered tents pitched on a dusty patch of ground. It wasn't equipped for lions, especially not lions that had been starved, beaten by the elements, and traumatized by months of terror. Veterinarians rushed in as soon as the truck pulled up, their faces tight with shock. No one had been fully prepared for how bad it would be. Skin clung to bones like wet paper. Open sores wept infection. Some of the lions were so dehydrated that their veins had collapsed, making it nearly impossible to give them IV fluids. The rescuers watched helplessly as the vets worked around the clock. They cleaned wounds, injected antibiotics, and tried to feed the lions tiny bits of meat broth through tubes. Every little success, every shallow swallow, every tiny flicker of a tail was celebrated like a miracle. But the truth was, not all of them would make it. Within the first 48 hours, 2 of the lions slipped away. Quietly, no drama, Just a final, broken breath, and then nothing. Dana sat by one of them until the end, whispering words she wasn't even sure made sense. Maybe it was for the lion. Maybe it was for herself. She kept thinking about how these animals had been royalty once, how they had trusted the world to protect them, and how the world had done nothing but let them rot. Their deaths hit the team harder than they expected. They had risked everything to bring them out alive, only to lose them on the other side. Malik punched the side of the truck until his knuckles bled. Others just sat, staring into nothing, the weight of failure pressing down like a mountain. But the others, the survivors, still had a chance. A slim one. Slowly, painfully, a few began to rally. The lioness Dana had found, the one she had whispered to in the cage, managed to stand up for the first time 3 days later. It took every ounce of her strength, her legs trembling like saplings in a storm, but she did it. She stood. She looked Dana straight in the eye, and for a moment, Dana saw something that nearly broke her. Defiance. Against hunger. Against cruelty. Against death itself. That moment spread through the camp like wildfire. Hope. Real, stubborn, clawing hope. Maybe they couldn't save all of them. Maybe they would carry the guilt of the ones they lost forever. But for the ones who lived, there was still something worth fighting for. The next step was harder still. The camp was only a temporary solution. The lions needed a real sanctuary, a place far from gunfire and broken promises. Somewhere they could heal, run, roar again without fear. And finding that place would take a miracle even bigger than the one they had just pulled off. Finding a sanctuary wasn't just hard, it was nearly impossible. Most zoos were too crowded or too scared to take in lions from a war zone. Big wildlife reserves didn't want the trouble of half-dead animals that needed endless medical care and might never recover. Even some of the animal rescue organizations that had cheered them on from a safe distance suddenly went quiet when it came time to actually open their doors. Dana made hundreds of calls. She emailed everyone she could think of. Wildlife parks, private reserves, even a few rich animal lovers who had their own exotic collections. Most didn't even bother replying. A few said the lions were too sick, too dangerous, too expensive. Each rejection felt like another slap in the face. They had saved these lions from bombs and bullets, only to watch the civilized world turn its back on them all over again. Weeks passed. The lions got stronger, but time was running out. The temporary camp wasn't meant for long-term care. It was getting harder to keep the lions healthy in such rough conditions. Supplies were running low. The media buzz that had once fueled donations was fading away, replaced by fresher scandals and tragedies. People were moving on. The team faced a brutal reality. If they couldn't find a permanent home soon, they might have to consider the unthinkable. Dana refused to even say the word out loud, but it hung in the air between them like smoke. Then, out of nowhere, a message came. It wasn't from a zoo. It wasn't from a sanctuary. It was from a man named Elias Verhoeven, a controversial billionaire with a reputation for saving endangered animals and for breaking a lot of rules doing it. His private reserve, hidden deep in the South African wilderness, was famous for giving second chances to animals no one else wanted. The catch? Elias had conditions. Harsh ones. The lions would never be displayed to tourists. They wouldn't be part of any breeding programs. They would simply be allowed to live out their lives as freely as possible. But it would mean cutting ties with the public completely. No more news stories, no more photo ops, no more human heroes. Just the animals, the land, and silence. It was a hard choice. Accepting his offer meant giving up control, trusting a stranger with the lives they had fought so hard to save. And there were rumors about Elias, rumors that he didn't always play by the rules, that he was willing to do whatever it took to protect his animals, legal or not. But in the end, it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about fame. It was about giving the lions a chance to be lions again. Dana called him back that night. They accepted the deal. And just like that, a new, desperate journey began. One final stretch across the world, into a place that promised redemption or ruin. Moving the lions across continents was a nightmare Dana hadn't even dared to imagine before. It wasn't as simple as booking a flight and showing up with a few cages. There were endless layers of bureaucracy, permits, inspections, and bribes. Governments dragged their feet. Airlines refused to carry dangerous cargo. Every day that passed chipped away at the lions' fragile recovery. But Elias was a man used to getting what he wanted. He pulled strings Dana didn't even know existed. Within a week, a private cargo plane was secured. A huge, rumbling beast of an aircraft designed for heavy equipment and military supplies. Now it would carry the battered kings and queens of the wild to their final home. The loading day was brutal. The lions, stronger now but still scarred and suspicious, had to be sedated again. It was a delicate dance between giving them enough drugs to keep them calm without risking their fragile bodies. The rescuers and vets moved with military precision, every action rehearsed a dozen times before. One by one, the lions were loaded into reinforced crates, each designed to survive the worst turbulence and shocks. When the plane finally took off, Dana sat in the cargo hold, surrounded by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the lions. It was the first time in months she allowed herself to cry openly. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from something that felt terrifying in its own right. Hope. The flight lasted hours, stretching into a strange twilight between exhaustion and adrenaline. Every jolt made Dana's heart skip. Every loud noise made her clench her fists. But the lions slept on, oblivious to the storm of emotions raging around them. When the wheels touched down on South African soil, a cheer erupted from the small group on board. No one cared about appearances anymore. They hugged, sobbed, laughed like lunatics. Against every odd, against every whisper of doubt and every roadblock thrown in their way, they had made it. Elias himself was waiting at the airstrip. He was nothing like Dana expected. No designer suit, no celebrity entourage. Just an older man in worn jeans, a sun-bleached shirt, and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He barely spoke, just nodded once at Dana and the team before directing his people to move the crates carefully into massive, specially designed trucks. Dana followed one of the trucks, her stomach twisting with nerves. What if this place wasn't what he promised? What if they had traded one kind of prison for another? But when they arrived, all those doubts disappeared. The sanctuary wasn't a zoo. It wasn't a cage. It was a wild, sprawling land that stretched as far as the eye could see. Grassy hills, thick groves of trees, wide open skies. No fences in sight, just hidden barriers miles out to keep the animals safe from poachers in the outside world. For the first time since it all began, Dana felt something inside her chest crack open and breathe. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally home. The day they opened the crates, nobody spoke. It felt like a sacred moment, one none of them wanted to disturb with words. The lions were groggy from the long journey, confused, blinking into the harsh African sun. For a long time they just stood there, unsure, as if waiting for another cage to close in around them. But there were no cages now, no walls, no war. One by one, the lions stepped out onto the warm earth. Some limped, their old injuries making each movement stiff and painful. Others, younger and stronger, stretched and sniffed the air with cautious wonder. The lioness Dana had bonded with was one of the first to lift her head high, her scarred body trembling as she took a few shaky steps forward. She turned once, just a flick of her eyes, back at Dana and the others. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion. It was something deeper, something older, a silent acknowledgement. Then she walked into the grass, disappearing into the tall reeds as if she had been born there. The others followed. No roars, no grand gestures, just quiet reclamation of something that had almost been lost forever. Dana stayed at the edge of the reserve long after the trucks had left, long after the others had started packing up their gear. She watched the grass ripple in the wind, hiding her lions from view. They didn't belong to her anymore. They never really had. They belonged to the wild now, to themselves. And even though she had saved them, even though she had fought harder for them than for anything else in her life, Dana understood something brutally important. Saving them didn't erase what had happened. It didn't erase the starvation, the fear, the years stolen by human cruelty and greed. But it gave them something that most victims of war never get: a second chance. As news of the Lions' rescue finally faded from headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies and scandals, the world moved on. People forgot. They always did. But somewhere, hidden deep in the wild, the broken kings and queens were healing, not because humans demanded it, not for cameras, not for applause, but because life, stubborn and beautiful, refused to give up. Dana left the sanctuary without fanfare. No speeches, no final tearful goodbyes. She didn't need them. She had seen enough. The world had abandoned them once. She had made damn sure it would never happen again. And if you listened carefully, if you stood very still at the edge of the reserve as night fell, you could sometimes hear it. A low, rumbling sound carried on the wind. Not a cry for help, not a whimper of pain, but a roar. Weak still, maybe, broken still, maybe, but it was a roar. And it promised that no matter what humans did, no matter how much cruelty they unleashed, some spirits could never, ever be tamed. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories that the world needs to hear. One last thing. If you believe survival is the ultimate rebellion, drop a comment. Would you risk everything to save those who can't fight for themselves? Let's talk.